Okay, I think we're live.
Hello, everyone. So, welcome to the FPL script. This is season 3, episode 4, Fast Fantasy. We are joined, of course, by Elevenify, our good friend, and we're here to discuss all the latest updates that Elevenify has made to his Substack, including team strengths, his fast fantasy model, his approach to playing fantasy football, and the obsession with xMins, which is currently uh, writ large in the analytics community. So, welcome, Elevenify. How are you?
Yeah, so the Substack and the website elevenify.com, for those people that don't know, it's just basically the place where I share and host all of the stuff that I'm already working on in my free time anyway, when I'm modeling the Premier League and doing fantasy stuff. So, on there we've got all kinds of predictions on the team level, and then on a player level you've got, goals and assists broken down each week. There's a lot of new stuff that I've been adding over the past season. So there's some team style profiles on there. There's a lot more team and player analysis articles up there. And then the most recent thing that I've added, which I think is of probably the most interest to the people listening to this kind of pod, is the fast fantasy model.
Yeah, makes sense. So, Fran, do you want to? Okay, so we already have the fast fantasy model up. So let's just start with it. So, I guess the first question is, what brought upon the need for a fast fantasy model, Elevenify?
Yeah, so the basis for this model is actually how I've played fantasy since the very first season, 5 or 6 years ago. I've had some form of this kind of model going up. It's obviously iterated over the years, but I've had a single number that's kind of represents future importance on this kind of scale as the core basis for my decisions for a long time. And I remember, I think towards the end of my first or second season, I had a conversation with Wee Rogue, Jamie, who everyone should know him. If you don't, he's the sort of OG team strength modeler, and he's the one who's really got me into all of this. But I remember talking to him about the model I had, this kind of single number representing a future importance of players, and he was very polite but somewhat brutal in his assessment of. He asked me, he said, I don't know why you don't just build a model at that point, and why you're not just sort of having a breakdown of actual points, having EV. To which at that time I didn't really have an answer. I thought, yeah, okay, that's a good point actually. And then I went off and I actually built a model, and it went from there. But then, despite that, I found myself over the seasons coming back to and always referencing this kind of simplified model. And I couldn't really put my finger on why. I thought maybe it was out of habit or convenience. But then I kind of realized it's mainly for two reasons, I think. The primary reason is, as someone that is, I have a lot of constraints on my time, and particularly after the initial COVID years, I was really trying to reduce the amount of time that I spent on making fantasy football decisions, because it's kind of just a bottomless, it's a bottomless pit, and there's no, the returns on your sort of research and planning you do, they come so quick, right? But you can just go on and on for what are unidentifiable gains, really. And that was what I realized this kind of model was doing. It was allowing me to play fantasy in a really fast and agile way. And no matter how sort of detached or zoomed out from what was going on a sort of, a very granular level each game week, I could still stay engaged, use transfers in a way that was sensible and keep myself in it. So that was really the core reason for it. And secondly, I think there is actually also decision making and strategic benefits to playing fantasy in this kind of way. Not necessarily solely playing it in this way, definitely not, but having this as an extra tool in the box to sort of get a sense check on things. So those are why I use it a lot. And then I thought this season, something I realized when I observed, the analytics space in fantasy is growing. People are using models more and more. People are using solvers more and more. And something I observed was that people didn't really have a sort of like an entry point for that. There was no gateway for it, really. It was you don't use models or solvers at all, and then it seems people were throwing themselves in the deep end. So I thought this was a good thing to release. So in addition to helping those people who are busy and have no time, it also helps people who want to learn a bit more. It's kind of like a beginner's guide to using models for fantasy.
Nice. So first of all, I would recommend people to listen to Virog and Simon's podcast, Corridor of Uncertainty. I don't even remember the last time they recorded an episode, but whatever episodes they do have up for modeling really did serve as a basis for my introduction into fantasy modeling as well. So they definitely are of great value. Also, if Elevenify, one question I had was if someone were to use this because we've always maintained, I remember even when we were doing World Cup 2022 X points modeling, I remember you always mentioned that this is supposed to be like a framework, a reference framework, and try not to take it literally. So how would you go about using this table to make fantasy decisions?
Yeah, sure. So you've got two kind of people that might use it, as I mentioned before. You've got people who would kind of use it as an actual fast, as it's labeled, a fast fantasy model. I play fantasy, maybe somewhat casually, but I want to do well, and I just don't have the time to do research. If you're that kind of person, it's very, very simple. You just I've lined it out as 2 steps basically. Like you can just only make transfers that increase your team's future importance rating. So don't do a transfer unless it increases the rating. Right. So obviously more advanced non-beginners listening know exactly what that means in the more complex world of modeling, because that is the name of the game. But just to simplify it, in plain English, whenever you're making any move in fantasy, you are generally making it across. You want to be making it across some sort of future horizon, and you should generally try and get more important players across that horizon in your team. So as players fade out of importance, you want to get the more important ones in. So that's the first step, is just make sure you're only making transfers that increase the future importance. So if you're using the table and you're actually practically using the table, just do that. That's your step 1. And then each game week, if you're doing that each game week, then you only really have one decision, which is your captaincy. So I've got the top 5 choices lined out. Pick one of them. If you don't want to do any thinking, pick the one with the most stars. But generally speaking, each game week, the captaincy decision will fall within, what I would call the margin of preference. So, just pick your best player in the best fixture. It's not super complicated, but the table tells you explicitly what to do.
And what horizon are we looking at for game weeks?
So for the table as it is, the horizon will generally be somewhere between 5 to 7 future game weeks with decay applied. So obviously, as a season goes on, the nuances to that will be where there might be a time where you wild card, or there's a particular reason you might want a shorter or even a longer horizon. But generally speaking, for most of the season, it's going to be within that 5 to 7 game week horizon.
Yeah, and so I wasn't suggesting that there needs to be a parameter, because as soon as you start introducing additional parameters, it starts going more towards the traditional expected value models, right? And that is exactly what you are trying to avoid. So, Fran, I had a question for you actually, because you've used Mikkel's algorithm, right? So,
yeah, I have.
Akin to BCV, because I've read about it from other people, but I never used it, so I don't know if you can compare those two.
I guess BCV probably pays a bit more attention to price point.
Okay.
And that
Fair
sort
enough.
of like cost efficiency aspect of a player.
Hmm.
Whereas I guess,
but it's trying to take out, basically, it's trying to condense a lot of decision making into one single, I don't know what to call it, attribute, I guess.
I think that's exactly the point, right? So yes, similar
Yeah.
to getting future importance here, you would try to increase the, I guess, total BCV of your team somehow, right? So
Okay, fair enough.
it works.
Yeah.
It works quite similarly.
Yeah. Nice.
Yeah. So I mean, it's interesting that we're talking about value already, because now we're starting to get onto the second point about why I ever really shared this in the first place, which is that I think it's helpful for complete beginners to start using this or looking at this kind of content to get them thinking about the right kind of things when it comes to using modeling in fantasy. So as you've mentioned about BCV, and you're looking at value, this model and these numbers are explicitly value neutral. That their value isn't incorporated in these at all. And part of that, yes, might be for simplification purposes, but I think it's also helpful for people to see these numbers without value, because what that is essentially doing is starting the first domino in, the first dominoes falling in the chain of thoughts that will, lead you to thinking, right, actually, this is an optimization problem, right?
Yes.
Like it's although it's a fast fantasy model, at a certain point I need to stop doing things for people. Otherwise there's just no model at all. It's just I'll just post every week, do this transfer, and you do this transfer. That's the ultimate fast fantasy. That's the ultimate fast fantasy model. But from actually learning about how you might apply these kind of techniques, that's quite helpful, I think, to see these numbers on this scale like that, and for beginners to look at these numbers and immediately think, what I imagine a lot of very, very beginners might do if they're faced with this table is they'll open up fantasy website. They'll put Salah in their team, who's number 1. They'll put Haaland in their team, who's number 2. They'll put Saka in their team, who's number 3. They'll put Son in their team, who's number 4, and they'll very quickly start to realize they're running out of money, right? So it's just another way that you start getting people thinking about the game as managing resources under constraints. So whilst we also might think there are a lot of different constraints, this gets rid of a lot of them, but price is one that they still have to think about.
That makes sense.
I guess the one question I have, sorry to jump in, is probably just on position, right? Because we see that defenders, I suppose, might not appear on this list, bar Trent, for now. Is there any thought to maybe how that could be adjusted? Because I wonder if when you're building a team, if you do start top down, how do you go back to also maybe reflecting the importance of a defender, or that sort of balance of value across the positions?
Yeah, so this is a really great question, and the answer to that is actually when I put this out there and I did sort of like a soft release on it, I opened it up. So I sort of said to people, if you have any questions on this, ask me. And one of the comments and questions I noticed a lot was people saying, where are the defenders? Where are the goalkeepers? For those that are listening on audio only, the picture we're looking at on the screen is just the front page of the top 20 players, and actually that
Yes,
page
120 players,
is
right?
So it's on the front page we're showing on the stream is 20 players. 19 of them are a forward or a midfielder. There's only one defender on there, which is Trent Alexander-Arnold. So one of the questions I got, or what some people were requesting, is they were saying, could you break this down by a position? So what we'd like to see is we would like to see future importance rating out of 100, but 4 different ratings. You have so you'd have like a goalkeeper that's 100, you'd have a defender that's 100, you have a midfielder that's 100, etc. That was something I think people wanted. And coming back to the idea that this is supposed to be something that's helpful for people to start thinking about the larger, more fundamental questions about modeling in fantasy, I think it's really important that, yes, you understand positions are a constraint and part of the rules. Whether you like it or not, you can't have just only 2 defenders. You have to have a minimum of 3 played, and you have to have 5 no matter what. Yes, that's true. But at the end of the day, what the problem of fantasy is it's about maximizing your points. So this kind of gets to the heart of, when people talk about positions and formations, actually poor logic, pure game logic underlies a lot of that thinking, because what really matters is the points that they score. So that's why I don't think this should be broken down into different positions, because it's important for people getting into thinking about fantasy in terms of predicted points and modeling to understand that the game has different rules. The sources of points are different. So you need to, if you want to be maximizing your points, you maximize it within that context, that point sources are different. So defenders are a really good example where, here in 2024, the average points scored by a defender might be a lot lower than the points scored by a defender years ago, when perhaps there were less goals per game and there were more clean sheets. Or conversely, the points from defenders now in 2024 might actually be more than they previously were, because the football meta has changed in such a way that, fullbacks are getting more attacking production than they've ever got, etc., etc., etc. The point is that you need to make sure that your choices actually reflect the core problem, which is maximizing points, and that is what's important. So that's why you need these condensed into one number, so that you actually, in a sort of very raw way, what is important and what isn't.
So one thing, because Fran and I are in one of the draft leagues, so I don't really want to disclose this to Fran, but I feel like if draft could benefit from a model like this much more. Because I was thinking, for example, if I have to weigh between, let's say, getting Trent on first pick versus getting Son on first pick, I can use this because this contextualizes all the positions into one, right? So if I use this as a rough guideline, if I convert these numbers into 38 game weeks, across 38 game weeks, I can easily set up a watch list based on this order roughly, right? I don't see a problem with that.
Yes, you could. You absolutely could do. I hadn't really thought about this too much in the context of draft, but then what gets interesting, the thing that strikes me immediately when you said that, is it gets to this core interesting problem about what is it exactly are you modeling and what is it that you value. And this is kind of the original versions of this model that I was kind of using in 19, 20, 21. They were a lot, quote, worse than this, and they had a lot more funky inputs. But ultimately, the core identity of this kind of simplified model is I'm throwing in a load of different stuff that I value, that I think is helpful in terms of predictivity and fantasy performance. So, for example, you've mentioned draft. One thing that you could throw into some model like this, and that I certainly have done in a very explicit way in the earlier models of this, is just simply a higher, more explicit value on injuries, for example. Because you've mentioned about extrapolating this out to a season long for draft, but actually if you're playing draft, the game constraints are very different, and there's a different consideration. So that strikes me as something immediately that you would need to factor in, that this might not explicitly tell you.
Yeah, that makes sense. So one question I had from a modeling perspective was, generally, so you just mentioned that you've been using a model of this kind since 2019, 2020. So what prompted you, or what was the jump in your confidence level that enabled you to start publishing this data? Because there has to be some sort of confidence level before you share data with people, right?
This sounds like you're inviting me to sort of do a humble flex about my fantasy ranks over the past few years. No, so I mean, at the end of the day, it's not. I don't provide. I'm not sure if I've fully got the question, but I definitely don't provide this with any guarantees. And it's certainly
No. Of course, I didn't mean that. Yeah,
it's like everything else that I provide on the site. This is my, that's the core identity of my site, I would say, is that here's a load of stuff that I'm using. Maybe you'll like it too. So that's really the motivation, in addition to thinking it can help people. Whether or not the numbers themselves are solid, I think I say in the FAQ on the website where you can find a better or more detailed model FPL review. Everyone knows that. But these are all my numbers, and I think, like I said, I think if someone used basically only this, they would get a 5-digit finish. Like, I'd be very confident of that.
A bold statement that I don't want to test out, because just in case it fails, to be honest, I don't have any guarantee that any method is guaranteeing.
The median manager would get there if they were applying it rationally.
Fair enough. Yeah. Fair enough. And you are attentive, closer to every single deadline, because that has definitely played a crucial role for most managers, I would say.
Yeah, but I guess
can we move on to the next one, or do you have?
Yeah, we could definitely move on. To be fair, I was just gonna finish on the point on draft, right, where you're probably just gonna have to discount the fixtures almost, and the decay aspect. Appreciate you standing my Discord logo, by the way, JD, for the people.
I'm trying to fix the lighting by the
podcast, but yeah, I was actually thinking about the defender point, but then I just realized actually most of the players who are actually priced similarly to defenders in the midfield and forward position anyways would be of less importance more often than not versus an actual good defender, like an Arsenal defender and a City defender. So whenever someone approaches the problem like with this, it'd be quite simple to build a team. So yeah, no comments here. Let's move on to how you got towards creating the draft. Was it just kind of how you approached it initially, where you went through the Haaland, the Salahs, the Sakas, I suppose? How would someone, have created this draft using the fast fantasy model, I suppose?
Yeah, so so firstly, you kind of get back to the original point about at its core, it's an optimization problem, right? So this draft is the example draft we're seeing on the screen. Shall I read it out for the listeners?
Yep, go for it.
I'll just quickly go through it. You just got a 4.5. You've got a 4.5 keeper and a 4.0. You've got Gabriel and Guardiola as the two premium defenders, with two 4.5s, Konsa, Anderson, a 4.0 that you would assume is a playing 4.0. Midfield is Saka, Fernandes, Gordon, Eze, and then whatever you think is the best 4.5. And then the front line is Haaland, Isaac, and then João Pedro or whoever you think is the best 5.5. So the process of coming to that is essentially, you know, from the very first game week, it's the core of what you're supposed to do. You know, step one, make transfers that maximize your future importance score. So that's, you know, game week 1, you have unlimited transfers. It's a wild card. So all of your transfers, throw them in, optimize for the future importance score. When I did this a week or so ago, this is roughly what it spat out. And crucially, it spat out something like this, but there was a couple of positions where, you know, the score is marginal and I've gone with my preference, which I think is a really important thing people miss just generally these days in analytical fantasy, is being too true, too ready to fall on your sword over sort of 0.0 something predicted points. I think I say somewhere in the fact like a handful of, you know, just, I roughly put a number on it for people, like sort of, I think sort of 5 or less future importance is a preference decision. But, you know, most weeks the choices that you're making in terms of EV are sort of closer to like a 55% and a 45% decision. You know, perhaps another way to put it is closer to like flipping a slightly uneven coin than it is, you know, like a 90% decision. People think about things in a very binary way, but the reality is if someone's 0.1 EV or 2 future importance ahead, that's what it's closer to. It's closer to a dodgy coin flip rather than this one's right, this one's wrong.
Yeah, makes sense. Do you have any questions on this front?
No, actually. I mean, this looks pretty similar to a draft that I have currently right now, so looks pretty good.
So I had only one question. So with the changes in rules brought about in FPL this season, do you think Elevenify that this has, or rather rolling 5 free transfers and through wildcard has actually enabled the usage of a model like yours even more?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the change in rules and the effect that has on free transfers, and whether you kind of consider them as a different kind of resource now or more of like a flow of something rather than a stock of something, is kind of the golden question right now, right? I definitely do not have a strong opinion on this. So I think the only possibly slightly interesting thing I have to say about this is that, you know, this kind of rule change, any kind of rule change is going to benefit engaged managers. That's a given. But this kind of rule change, I think, does benefit players who play in a more patient way, because what would have happened previous, and not in the way that you might think. I think people have assumed it benefits patient managers because you can roll up more transfers into your stock pile, i.e. managers who previously would have rolled 5 transfers, but they couldn't, now can, and they'll probably benefit from that. Yes, that is probably true, but I actually think there's a kind of other benefit to that, is that managers like me, I think I fall into this category, who were almost patient to a detriment with the increased stock of free transfers you can hold. I actually think it's going to help in those situations where you're being patient and then something throws you off, i.e. usually an injury or something like that, in a way that would really ruin you in previous seasons. You have a much better ability to fix it now. So to explain that perhaps in another way is that I actually think the value is not in the 5 free transfers as much as it is in transfers 3 and 4. So to just explain, like anecdotally, what would have happened for patient managers or for me previously is you specifically dedicate yourself to a strategy that has a long-term payoff in mind, but certain things can happen over that long-term horizon that just basically undo all of your good work. You know, a long-term strategy oftentimes requires you to take a big bet on someone or something happening or not happening, and then if that doesn't happen, if that doesn't work anymore because of injury or something like that, you're kind of your whole line is, you're a bit screwed, really. But what I think will allow, what will be allowed for those kind of managers is, around those kind of 3 or 4 transfers, you can stick to your long-term plan and fix what happened in a way that you couldn't previously.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I think for most people who are not habituated to stockpiling transfers, this is going to be quite the seismic shift in their thought process. So hopefully we can use models like yours to maybe make quick decisions. So this is I remember Neil deGrasse Tyson has a book called Astrophysics for People in a Hurry. So this is essentially fantasy football for people in a hurry, right?
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, because we've mentioned sort of longer term play and whether it benefits this kind of model. I mean, looking at this draft here, I do think that this is the kind of draft that the model or playing like this encourages. It's generally going to be quite predictable. It's generally going to be a bit of a slow burn, a bit of a safer, if for lack of a better term, draft. And if there is any, one definite negative with this kind of play, I mean, just looking back in history, playing in this kind of way isn't going to allow you to necessarily react to, just purely on the model future importance perspective. Those cases, like, was it 3 years ago we had the Gundogan
playing further forward?
Yeah. There was a really obvious Gundogan. I say obvious in hindsight, but I think, from a decision hygiene perspective, there was probably enough information at the time to make good, healthy decisions and realize that there was a role change. So this kind of model wouldn't pick that kind of thing up. But that's the kind of thing is the same with, even if you're using FPL review or a complicated model, it's a tool in your toolbox. It's supposed to be used in the context of what is actually going on.
So I think you pointed out rightly that even review would suffer from because it looks at more data and it does not try to react too quickly. I remember that, granted that review was in a much more nascent stage than it is now, back when Gundogan was playing in a different position, but I certainly remember seeing that review reacted quite late to it. And even last season, I would say Guardiola was a similar case, albeit for maybe fewer game weeks. I can't really remember how many game weeks Gundogan lasted for.
I might disagree on the Guardiola point. Is I think the issue with Guardiola would always have been the xMins that you have for him.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think people were also had similar reservations with City attackers back then when Gundogan had a role change. But as Elevenify pointed out, that the role change itself was so significant that EV shift would have probably meant he would get into most teams, at least in hindsight, the EV change in hindsight, because in foresight, unfortunately, none of the models could capture that properly.
Yeah, that's fair. I think you always have situations like that each season. Like Nuri playing up top for like 3 games in a row because of the destitution of Wolves and their bench.
Absolutely.
But you also, I mean, players come back into the field. He comes back into left back, and suddenly you don't really want to own him anymore.
Yeah. I mean, let's not understate how difficult the problem is, right? This is the core issue: is that you want to incorporate new information at the optimal rate. You do it too quick and it's too noisy. You run the risk of getting so much noise that it's got no signal. But you do it too slow, and you miss out on those genuine changes. So I think if you play solely using this kind of model, that's the only thing, is it is always going to on the side of being slow and being safe, going with the known.
Yeah, I also experienced a similar thing in Euro Fantasy. A lot of people provided feedback that, why didn't I reduce Mbappe's EV drastically, because it was, they could see that his broken nose was causing so much issues. And it was very difficult to explain to people why I cannot just flip a switch and make Mbappe. I don't know. I mean, I don't want to disrespect any other striker, but maybe a player who doesn't get much npxG per 90. Because I almost said Chris Wood, then France. I saw Fran, and I remembered Chris Wood is actually legitimately good, so I can't say Chris Wood.
Yeah, good. Don't want to see Taiwo Awani anytime
Yeah,
soon. So,
fair enough. Oh, Ferran Torres. Let's go with Ferran Torres. Yeah.
yeah, why not? Okay, I think a key point that you highlighted was how the decision making through the fast fantasy model is also sort of looking at what we call avoiding the, I guess, desperate chase for maximum EV that is quite popular nowadays. Like when we hear people talk about their solves, it's always, this is slightly higher EV than the other, but then a manager who thinks about how robust their draft is probably isn't so fond of just looking at the top line, and they'll try to understand what exactly, each draft that they're sort of proposed with, that when they run a solve is sort of throwing up, I suppose, through issues like transfers down the line, what's forced, what's not. So shall we just jump into the discussion on xMins? I know you guys actually already started discussing this yourself, which is sort of the landing spot.
I can probably build this up a little bit. So Elevenify had a chat, and I had a chat, but also I saw Sartal or someone recently retweeted Trout's tweets where he had explained how stochastic optimization is very different from the solves we usually get on review, which is a heuristic problem that review solves. So when I saw the fantasy importance model from Elevenify, it reminded me of that stochastic optimization problem where he's trying to condense all the computationally heavy work into sort of one metric again, as I coined it before. But the other thing that we talked about, and I'm going to come to Elevenify to get his views again on this, is that this hyper obsession with changing minutes by one to try to get that last drop of EV, which I coined it as precision that does not exist. So it's you're trying to be as precise as possible, but that precision has no meaning. Similar to trying to talk about xg in the third decimal place, because you can say this chance was 0.126 xg instead of 0.212, but that the 6 has no meaning there because there is no way to interpret that. So I just wanted to get Elevenify's thoughts on the change in meta when it comes to obsession with xMins.
Yeah, so really, really well said there. I agree with all of that. That's a good intro. I think so. The general thoughts on this have been sort of ruminating a lot more recently when I look at social media, forums, Discord channels that have an analytical focus of people who are using models, using solvers, and what is the content of those discussions. And I've just noticed that discussions are almost entirely about expected minutes. So it's been said for a while that expected minutes is perhaps the last edge. Like a couple of people have said that. No, don't think so. I don't think that's the case, and it's definitely not the case in the way that people are treating it as such. So you shouldn't be adjusting your minutes and thinking that's everything. That's the whole process. There's no sort of quest that if you can get the perfect X minutes, you've solved it. You're there. So I feel like some people are sort of shaking their fist in the air and shouting at the clouds, sort of saying, "Oh, if only I could know exactly how many minutes every single player plays, then I would win fantasy games." And I just don't think that's true. And what I see happening is in the same way, to take another phrase from We Rogue from Jamie, in the same way that people used to get drunk on their models, people are equally getting drunk on their minutes and then drunk on their solvers and the outputs they get from those kind of things. And I think the reality is that if you are looking at two vastly different paths and lines that are sort of crucially dependent on the minutes you predict for one of your players 4 game weeks down the line being sort of 5 minutes either way, and that's going to take you down 2 different paths, you've lost the plot, in my opinion, because at that point you need to be taking a step back and thinking about everything and realizing that ultimately this is a game, and which is kind of coming back to the whole fast fantasy model, I think, is that people forget that this is a decision, it's a decision-making game. You're the one that's making the decisions. There's lots of different decisions to make. And, I just see people making poor decisions off the back of such granular X minutes predictions that I think it's just simply bad play. I think it's better for a lot of things to think about long-term assumptions of sort of general minutes ranges, and then try and, this can be done through solvers and through running different solves and comparing them as well, and then trying to get a comparison. Sensitivity is why I'm quite a fan of sensitivity analysis. It's because you need to sort of work out how far away from different lines are you based on different assumptions and your confidence in those assumptions, because it comes back to the whole discussion about as you said, you're trying to find precision that doesn't exist, and this is also part of the point around the actual X minutes number that you put in, and then also coming back to something I did a lot of previously when it comes to lineup predictions. I've seen a lot of people, when they look at lineup predictions and participate in lineup predictions, they want mass Hivemind minutes to be quantified in terms of a percentage of start. So, i.e., you want to ask 50 people who do you think will start at the weekend, and you give those 50 people the ability to put a percentage on the likelihood of their start. And I've actually, this is just my view, I actually see no evidence that will improve predictions over versus just making someone pick start or not start. And I think that's kind of, it gets to this whole point about looking for precision that doesn't exist, and then just leading you to make bad decisions.
So I remember, Elevenify, I think it was your first appearance on this podcast where we spoke about Man City predictions in general, and we also touched upon the fact that the reason people miss there's a misconception amongst people that percentage or percentage of people predicting one player to start is the same as percentage of minutes that that player gets, is primarily caused by this, right? Because you ask 50 people to vote yes or no, and then you aggregate those results and you present them in a way which people can interpret incorrectly. And the second thing about that was you also mentioned that someone could get a lot of predictions right, even if you ask them to predict actual minutes. But because you don't know the thought process behind those predictions and you don't weigh them with the decision that they made prior to making the prediction, you don't know if they got it right by sheer luck or because they were actually skilled. And then their weightage increases because you think of them as a skilled player because they're getting stuff right. But ultimately, it's just adding more noise to the overall xMins model.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I agree with all of that. And it just comes back down to the whole, another point about all of this is, at the risk of sounding like a nihilist, like there's no feedback loop in any of this, really. So it's so difficult.
Yeah, absolutely. Do we want to move on to Team Strengths fan, or do you have something to ask?
I don't have anything to ask, but I think just in terms of xMins, I still think it's really worth looking into xMins, just because you might always find solutions that are cute that can still work as long as you've considered what Elevenify said, which is sort of running solves when you have like good, bad, and I guess average cases. So funny thing is, because we saw the joke about Oscar Bob, but he's a 5 million player. You can see that even on the fast fantasy model draft, or a lot of popular drafts now, that you have a 4.5 midfielder as an example. So I guess the question is, can you find 0.5 to still create a very strong draft, and then mess around with the idea that Bob could be someone who you can optimize around at the beginning, whilst also considering that he's more than likely not going to play a single minute after, say, game week 1, and how much you'd lose, let's say, compared to a draft that doesn't have Bob, that has Winks instead, or has Rogers, right? Someone who might not even see the field, because if you have João Pedro or you have Armstrong and he's your 7th attacker, you're probably going to play Rogers as the first auto sub bench option every week, and you probably wouldn't be that keen on Winks ever auto subbing for you anyway. So I guess it's quite negligible between Rogers and Winks, but I still think it's fun sometimes to just play around with xMins, as long as you understand what you're losing as an opportunity cost, and where you can be a little bit playful with things. Like we tend to see with solvers interesting rotation pairs, and maybe like aspects of your draft which can potentially be bolstered or weakened if, let's say, I don't know, let's say a good example is Porro. Really bad fixture in Game Week 4, plays versus Arsenal. We know that I think Kadioglu is close to Brighton, so that's not great for Barco, but Barco could be someone who can give your draft a lot of a lot of expected value back if he's a 4.0 that you pick, and it actually makes the Porro pick better. But at the same time, you can run drafts without Barco and see what the EV is there, and you just run, let's say, Harwood Bellis, and you can still find Porro there. And I think that's sort of situations where, if you're obsessive enough about xMins and you're consistent enough in terms of, do you go through every single team? Do you sort of conceptualize every week how many minutes a player can play? Like, I think there are players who play 90 minutes and there are players who play somewhat in the middle of that and can still consistently start games. Andreas is a good example of that, although he might leave Fulham. And then you have players who are just extremely volatile and probably not worth messing around with, particularly considering the price point. So I gave Oscar Bob as a good example, because I do think there are situations where you can mess around with things like that, and it's very niche, but it can still work out as long as you consider what happens if, on all my simulations, I suppose, what happens if Bob just doesn't play a single minute after game week 1? Does my draft still come out as really robust? Because I as I've probably featured before, like I've featured some Rogers drafts, and I realized that there's actually no weeks that I play Rogers anyway. So can I just insert Bob in that situation and probably benefit a little bit if I was going to go with Rogers as my eighth attacker? And I think in those cases, I tend to say I don't really mind that. But at the same time, playing with a lot more safety and considering also the rule changes, totally fine playing for a lot of robust players and not obsessing about 0.1. Another thing, last point too, but it's another thing to look at is when you look at review, I think a lot of people sort of immediately neglect things like just clicking on a player, looking at the decay that is actually applied on that sort of player, because that can change a lot of things for yourself. Like, it's more important to actually be aware of the whole macro perspective of how you apply xMins and look at how players come out in your drops. Like, I found that, let's say Haaland doesn't really show up if you don't adjust his xMins, not because the face mins look wrong, but because the minutes with the aggressive decay after game week 1 look a little bit off. The same thing, I guess, if you're someone who, and I was speaking to Pingreen just on DMs the other day, but he wasn't really aware that Trent had an availability tax, but the face mins once again are 85. So I think it's just worth, once you become really obsessed about these things, that you can look into things like that, and you can find out, I don't know, Henderson, for example, has 74 xMins. You might want to adjust that up if you're fully confident he's the first starting goalkeeper, and that's not going to be a big issue because we already know Johnson is probably leaving the club, and things like that. So I just think it's worth still looking at a lot of things like that, because you can still find a little bit of edge, although sometimes, yeah, the returns are imprecise and not worth anything. Like, I'm not talking about 0.1 EV, I suppose. I'm talking about what could end up being 2-3 EV, and that starts
and
to
also
become
saving
important.
maybe a couple of free transfers.
Yeah.
So I'm glad you
Yes,
said that, because sorry, Elevenify, go ahead.
I know, it's just yeah. So those are really, really good points. So let me just clarify and add a couple of things. So to clarify, so firstly, you absolutely should be looking at xMins in a very detailed and granular sense for the specific game week that is coming up, the one that is immediately in front of you. Now, where my skepticism comes from is it comes from the longer term view of expected minutes assumptions, and getting particularly granular as you get further and further in the future. And you've raised a very, very good point about, if you're using a tool like Review or you're using any kind of model, you're predicting the minutes every week and you are applying some sort of decay, but ultimately this is your input and you need to do it sensibly and appropriately. So you've used a really good example of Oscar Bob, and I think that's a good example because it's exactly as I said. It's the kind of thing where, yeah, you absolutely should be really, really granular about his expected minutes this week, i.e. game week 1. But then, you then have to make a decision. And I mean, you as the individual, you have to make a decision on what are his future expected minutes, right? So you could put him as 80 minutes for game week 1, but if with Oscar Bob as an example, it might be a very inappropriate example to have a decay of 80, 75, 70, 65, 60.
Correct.
You need to have Oscar. I'm not taking a position either way, but perhaps the other alternative that might be more likely is Oscar Bob is 80 minutes, 70 minutes, 50 minutes, 0. Yeah. But ultimately that's user input. So that's really important to think about as well, because ultimately that's on you. That's not on the robot, because let's be clear about this and take a step back. Why are we actually obsessed and why do we care about expected minutes? In one sentence, we care about minutes because all of the models are based on, output prediction that it's dependent on how long they play, right? It's like per 90, it's the classic per 90 stuff, right? We have an idea that a player does stuff, and if they're on the pitch for more time, they'll do more stuff. So that's why we care about it. But my issue with the longer term part of it is I see people adjusting minutes and making assumptions where they're looking at two possible lines. And let's take Saka as an example. They're looking at sort of a Saka and a non-Saka line where they've got sort of over 5 weeks. The difference is 85, 84, 83, 82, 81 versus like 82, 81, 80, 79, 78, where it's like just a handful of minutes over a long horizon is causing you to have a choice between a Saka draft and a non-Saka draft. And just what I don't like about it, and what I think is explicitly bad play, is that people get in that scenario. Okay, you can get in that scenario very easily, but they don't realize that they're in that scenario and they still have a decision to make. You know, you can still take a step back and be like, oh, hang on a minute. I need to realize that the consequence and the implication of this. Am I actually happy with that? You know, from a decision hygiene perspective, am I happy to lose Saka over that handful of minutes, over that precision that doesn't exist?
Yeah, I think you're completely right there. And to be fair, that sort of goes back to your point about when you have, let's say, someone within 2 future fantasy points or importance points away from each other, and you suddenly just pick the one that you're leaning with for whatever reason. I feel like players are more guilty of that than, oh, I really can't have Saka in my draft because he's suddenly not optimal because I've adjusted his minutes by 2.
Yeah.
So I think
Elevenify used the same example when we were talking about Saka, because he's barely played any minutes in preseason, right? So if adjusting his minutes down by a couple of minutes is going to lead to you not picking him in your team, that just means that your draft is not robust at all. It's quite likely that you're looking at a singular line which shows it has higher EV, but it's actually not when it collapses into reality. So I just noted down a couple of things, because what Elevenify was saying was spot on, and I just wanted to say, first of all, I'm glad Fran pointed those things out, because we were never advocating for not looking at xMins, and Elevenify already pointed that out. Also, we have a recurring segment on this podcast called xMins Corner, so it would be hypocritical of me to say that it doesn't matter. Thirdly, I had a chat with Sartal last month where I was talking to him about what is his general approach is to simulations and trying to gauge how robust a particular draft or line of transfers is. And we also discussed what methodology Days of Victory uses. Days of Victory is a fan team user who is perhaps the most successful fan team user of all time, and therefore one of the best fantasy managers of all time. So when we found out, I found out that he essentially uses plus minus 10%, and he uses a random number generator to perturb values of every player to simulate, which intuitively makes a lot of sense. And I was using values close to that, but I asked Sartal the same question that so Sartal Pentrout came up with a very elaborate method to perturb values for players, and I was asking him, the time that you're investing in this and the plus or minus 10%, what do you think has a better rate of return? And even he started to think about it, and it made sense to him that maybe plus or minus 10% is simple enough. It does not have a ton of scientific evidence behind it as to why it should work, but also intuitively it does work, and it does not lead to funky results, which is what we always fear, right? That it will lead us down a path where there is no coming back, essentially, in fantasy terms. So that was a very interesting discussion I had. Maybe we can discuss that in another podcast. And to your last point, Fran, the availability tax for Trent that you spoke about, right? And that's a very good point. I feel like that's more of a review feature that
yeah, it is.
people
That was review
need
specific.
to be aware of. That my point, or rather both of our points, was largely towards how granularly you look at xMins. So I understand you are also going for that, but people also need to be aware that review has a feature where there's an availability tax, and maybe it needs to be stated somewhere on the main screen, because it seems to be a very pertinent point. So that's a great shout.
Yeah, and I mean, while we're talking about review features and we're talking about, you know, souls lines and X minutes, I mean, one thing I would encourage anyone who's listening that uses review, I would ask the question to those listeners whether they know what the eval score is and if they've ever paid attention to it. If they know what it means and if they've ever paid attention to it. If the answer's no, then I don't think we have time now, but at the risk of sounding like an IKEA salesman or something, like read the instructions before you use these tools. Like,
Fair enough.
He's got a glossary. Go and read it. Make sure you know what you're doing before you use it. And that's, again, it comes back to part of the motivation for releasing my simplified model is that I just see people making so many mistakes because there's nowhere for them to ease into it. They're sort of jumping in the deep end. Obviously, none of this is, just to be clear, obviously none of this is a criticism of review. He has a glossary that I'm telling you to go and read. But I think, it's the habit of most people is that they buy a review subscription and they go straight in and they just don't really know what they're doing and they get bad habits.
And anecdotally speaking, the most common question I've seen on Analytics Discord is from newcomers is always, why is review preferring this line over the other, even though this line shows less EV compared to the other? And every time someone has to point them towards, look at the eval score, and then that resolves their query every single time.
Yeah, it's a good point too, because it's also kind of close to what I personally take issue with is when we go on the timeline, or some members go on the timeline and just take the binary approach of saying someone's optimal or they're not. Really annoys me, but
yeah, we can move on probably to the final segment, which is Elevenify's team strengths. So, Elevenify, do you want to take us through this quickly? Because I know we have been streaming for a long time, so we don't want to take up much more of your time.
Yeah, so maybe we could just talk about this a little bit. Maybe, I don't know if you want to do some quick few of the chat questions or whatever. But I guess as a small plug, I will be doing more audio content myself this season, particularly talking about analytical team strength and things like that. So pay attention to that. I think these numbers that we were showing now are basically pretty much as close to final as they're going to get. We're in sort of margins territory now. I don't know if there's sort of one or two teams you want to focus on, or
I think on chat we were discussing Chelsea and West Ham, so these two teams have a lot of transfers, and I guess the question would be, how do you approach the team ratings for teams with such drastic changes?
Yeah, so what I've been moving into more and more, just the short answer is that something I'm moving into more and more on the team side is incorporating player level stuff. So whereas previously I think a lot of people making team strength models would deal with the player and transfer changes by bringing in market odds and or doing some kind of crude value, transfer fee, wages kind of approximation. So that's generally been the traditional way of doing it. I've been playing, and that the model I did last season, prior to last season, did incorporate market odds. So this year I don't. So it's independent of markets this year. That's partly because I had got far along enough the player integration part of it, but also just this year we haven't got a lot of market odds that we would usually get on a team level. Like we've got no season long markets for goals and at the time of recording we've got no season long goals and goals against from markets. So there's nothing really to incorporate. So you've asked about, so that's generally the approach that I'm doing. And I mean, that's kind of a lot of the inspiration for that has also, funnily enough, come from the modeling I do in F1 in Formula One, because Formula One modeling is actually a very interesting, different kind of problem where you have ostensibly two drivers that are in the same kind of car, so but you've got 10 different teams, so you kind of, it's a great problem of trying to extrapolate and parse out who's the better driver from the different teams when you consider that they're in the different cars, and and then the cars are better on different tracks and blah 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 blah, all of that kind of thing. But basically it's still that kind of fundamental question of what is the points above replacement kind of thinking methodology of players. So it's basically adjusting for that in some way, which is not explicitly value and wage for me. It's trying to get some sort of independent contribution measure in terms of the goals or expected points or goals against to that team. So it's interesting you've mentioned Chelsea and West Ham, because I actually think I don't think it's really, yes, Chelsea buy a lot of players and I keep buying a lot of players and a lot of bad players and a lot of spending a lot of money. But the reason they're coming up quite good, I don't think, is that they were fine. They were good last season. Like they're coming from a good place, really. And that's the thing, is also flipping that on its head as well. I don't think they've got a very good team, but they did quite well last season. So I don't really think it's as applicable for Chelsea. The West Ham question is a good one, and they've had a change of manager and they're buying a lot of players, so that's what's seen them rule. Because I'm very, very low on West. West Ham were terrible last season.
Can you speak more to Fulkrug and how much you love the transfer?
No, but you know what? I think so. Yeah, I think the Fulkrug deal is just a bad deal. Like, it's financially obviously bad, giving a 4-year contract to a 31-year-old. But like, I was just surprised to see so many people saying, "Oh, this is great, Fulkrug's going to cook," blah 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 blah. When actually he's got very average underlyings. I think I said on Twitter, the markets are expecting him to get sort of 11 to 12 goals this season, and I would be happy to take the under on that, because when I look at my model numbers, to sort of get that level of goals, you would be looking at sort of 3,000 minutes plus a load of penalties, which is quite a lot of assumptions. So, but obviously you've kind of baited me a little bit into talking about Fulkrug. But to be fair to the West Ham, the rest of their business has been very good. It seems. It's just Fulkrug is very, very weird. The Somerville deal is good. I think is Todibo done? All of their other business
almost done or something.
Yeah. All their
Rodriguez is done. Yeah.
But surely Fulkrug's still an upgrade over Antonio, right?
Yes. But I mean, West Ham also have previously had Allaire and Scamacca and yeah. So anyway, but West Ham, but I think when I did the first run of the this year's model, that sort of basically very minor changes to last year's data, West Ham were like 17th. Something. They were 16th, 17th, fighting with Wolves. Really bad, really bad. So even with these changes or these upgrades, they're still below average. But massive difference between the markets. So I'm sure some people will want me to put my money where my mouth is, but I think it's like a 7-point difference between me and the markets on West Ham or something. Maybe a little bit less now, but yeah, they're doing good business overall, but from a modelling perspective, it's a real tough one because you've got. I would argue, I hadn't really thought about this before, but has there really been such a big summer overhaul over the past few years that I can think of, where you've got a change in manager and this level of business happening all at once?
No, I mean, we can probably find similar cases, but I don't think to this extent, where it's almost an overhaul of the entire core of the team. Because they got basically 2 new center backs now. They got almost an entirely new midfield and almost an entirely new front three. I mean, Kudus is there obviously, but
And Bowen as well, yeah. But...
yeah, Bowen as well, yeah, fair.
Yeah, I think it's I will say just generally as well on team strength modeling and this season coming up, I think it's going to be, from a prediction perspective, and because you've asked about the sort of player integration of it, I think it's going to be a fascinating season in the sense that because of various financial reasons, a lot of teams' business is shifting towards like future investment and is shifting towards those kind of transfers. It's really hard sometimes to put, again, coming back to this whole point, you're looking for precision that doesn't exist, but to with a lot of these transfers, it's unclear whether or not they're really actually going to be making that team better now or not.
Yes, I see what you mean. So one last question from my side. So I had briefly spoken to you about a points above replacement model, right? And I'm still interested to see how we can model that for football compared to something like basketball, where it already exists, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, it's like an on-off. In basketball, you have, I guess, on-off numbers when you're a player who's in a team.
On ESPN, right? If I
you can see them anywhere. So Basketball Reference is a good example. You can find a player and see effectively how additive they are to the points that a team scores and concedes whilst they're on the field versus off the field. And I think FBref also right now has XG plus or minus per 90 on off as well.
They do. Yeah. You're right. Yeah. Yes, but I thought that was on off as in when they were on the field and off or something like that.
Yeah. So it's similar to that as well.
Okay. I see. So my question to Elevenify was: so if we can get a facsimile of the points above replacement model for football, do you think that would help model teams like Chelsea and West Ham better in terms of team strength when they have such a massive, not Chelsea, but more West Ham when they have such a massive overall?
Maybe it's a good question, because then I think you've got problems within problems there, haven't you, as well? Because the thing is as well with a lot of these, I mean, Chelsea's a really good example where it's sort of, they're buying all of these players, but I don't know how they're simultaneously going to develop all of these players. So whereas if you compare the age bracket and profile of player that Chelsea have bought in mass, and you look at then perhaps Man United and what they've done with Lenny Yoro, with Lenny Yoro, that's a good case of kind of like, not really one to improve Man United now, but I can see a development path for him there. I think we could make good progress on like getting an idea of how he at different times might improve Man United. But with Chelsea, they've just got so many different players. You've no idea how the minutes will fall. And then also they keep changing their managers. So I think the joke was always that Chelsea buy every central player under the sun, and then they've got a new manager and he's brought in and Dewsbury Hall with him from Leicester, who's like, obviously a lot of these players aren't the same, but the whole point is there's only so many central minutes they can go around. So yeah, it's a tough one.
Yeah, Fran, do you have any final thoughts? Because we can get to the chat questions maybe, and then.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, you don't have any other clubs to touch on or anything interesting?
So, I mean, the bottom three clubs are as expected, so there are no surprises there. I guess Wolves would be one of those where uh, I don't know if the considerations are that Pedro Neto has been sold, or do you still have to incorporate, or he will be sold, or you still have to incorporate that?
The Wolves rating is neither pre or post Pedro Neto staying or being sold, because even when he was at Wolves, he never played. So
Fair enough.
Good point.
Because he's always injured. But no, this is pre. I'm really low on Wolves. I really don't think they were. I really don't think they were very good last year. I think I saw
Always have been.
Gary O'Neill got a new 4-year contract today.
Yeah.
Oh wow. Okay.
Yeah, I've always been very low on Wolves. They're you know, I mean, if you dig into the numbers with Wolves, they got like quite an interesting, weird set of outliers in a couple of different statistics. But that, you know, so what I mean by that is they're an obscenely dribbly team. They dribble the ball so much more than anyone else. But at the end of the day, also, if you want to see this kind of stuff, this is the kind of stuff I do with the style profiles on my website as a small plug. But if you look at that for carry tilt, which is my rating for like a team's preference for using carries or dribbles to attack, Wolves last season are like up around 90, you know, and these are like kind of almost percentile ratings of every team. So they carry the ball a lot, but they just don't produce anything. So their attack is incredibly low, and I don't think their defense was, despite sort of stereotypes of them now being solid, they concede a lot of chances. So yeah, I don't think Wolves are very good. I don't think they're going to get much better.
Yeah, another interesting side note is Bournemouth is very slightly above Fulham, and so that's the win to start the season.
Yeah. And Brentford slightly higher than Bournemouth, so we'll stay tuned.
Where has that come from?
Well, Elevenify is on the pod, and he always likes to add Brentford in there.
Oh yeah, yeah. He was talking to me about how he thinks Sharda might start the season, so we'll see if that transpires. Anyway, let's get to the chat if there are any questions.
Yeah, I'll probably just panel the questions. So hey to everyone who joined in early and hopefully is still around. Thank you guys for tuning in. I guess first question was just on Murphy and Livramento. I mean, any thoughts on those players and welcoming them into your potential FPL teams?
Yeah, let's go with Elevenify if he has anything to add.
Sorry, I didn't catch that. Was it Murphy?
Yeah, Murphy and Livramento.
Yeah, I mean, it's I've got less of a view on Murphy. Livramento is a classic, although it's obvious, it's an obvious answer. It's a classic minutes.
Yeah.
The answer will be in the minutes. So again, I don't think it's that interesting of a comment. But if you have a reason to believe that he's going to play good minutes, then sure. But I think as the days go on, it's looking worse and worse. Is those fullback positions looking quite stacked when they look like they might be quite thin? So yeah, I'm not particularly high on it, but I'm not super close to it either.
Yeah, I think on Murphy, I'll just say Barnes was not in the squad today, so if he's injured again, then that's quite huge for Murphy, because if you can, I guess, assume he starts most of those opening games, that's incredible. But for the most part, I'd probably avoid both for now, unless we got significant Barnes news. Is probably my position, even though Barnes is actually a left winger. It's just I think, you know, Anthony Gordon is someone who will also cut into those right winger minutes, especially when Barnes comes on, and Murphy is a traditional sub early in the game anyway. Newcastle, so that's all.
So
I think someone's asked about Solanke in your model, but I assume that's not been.
Sorry. One question from my side was, how often are you planning on updating the model ratings?
Which team strength? everything on the site will update after every game week. Same. That was the same as last season, and the same as this season. So as a general rule, because I do get asked this a lot. There isn't currently an easy way for me to integrate onto the site a kind of like automatic last updated and a time thing. So people always ask me, when was this update? When was this updated? It's updated after every game week as soon as I can, basically. So again, it comes back to the whole point of the site being like, you have everything that I have, basically, because I've got it like all integrated. So when I update it, it updates on there as well.
Got it.
I think there are a couple questions that all center around Solanke. So maybe if you could just talk about what you think about the Solanke transfer, Elevenify, and I guess how, maybe informally, if you think there's any significant changes to his future team and future importance. Sorry.
Yeah, so I think it's definitely a very interesting question, because certainly a large, confident portion of his production at Bournemouth was in penalties, whereas that will not be the case at Tottenham. I would also guess it's quite funny is that before all of this happened, I sort of did a tweet about Solanke and I posted his radar, and I kind of said that, the reason I like Solanke is because he's on the pitch all the time. He's a good striker. He's not a great striker. He's a good striker that is on the pitch all the time. He's going to play 3,100 minutes every season at Bournemouth. I honestly don't know what his minutes are going to look like at Tottenham, because it's not. This is the point. The reason I like Solanke is because he plays all those minutes because he can. He is incredibly reliable, incredibly fit. So it's not a question mark over that. It's a question mark over that he's in a better team where there's more alternatives, where perhaps there's going to be more different kind of game plans and rotations, that kind of thing. So you're going to be looking at less minutes, less penalties, but the actual general, like sort of non-penalty baseline, I would imagine is significantly better. So I think it's, if I haven't done any work on this at all, but if I had to put a finger in the air, I think that his sort of season projections is going to almost stay identical. This kind of rough 15 goals across the season mark, which I think the last time I looked is roughly what I had him have, give or take. I think that's probably about right, all in all.
Yeah. So decrease in penalty goals. The
real hot take is that he makes Spurs defense better. That's the hot take there.
In terms of like set piece defending and stuff like that.
Yeah, just his general play makes. But I'm talking like 0.1 or 0.2.
Yeah, which is important for Spurs.
For Pedro Porro.
This is also that Tottenham don't get featured in an article by you midway through the season. No, but actually, the interesting thing on Solanke, I suppose, is Richarlison has been out of the squad, and I guess he's still nursing his injury. So if you think that his minutes will be hampered over the overall course of the season, he could start the season with good minutes, but he himself has a quote unquote toe injuries. I don't know what that is. So we'll see what happens with Solanke, but he could be interesting to start, because I'd imagine the Tottenham fixtures are slightly better than the Bournemouth ones are just from game week 1. But I don't think he's like anywhere near my draft right now, despite the transfer, is my position.
Yeah, and I would imagine that it's, again, not super close to it, but I would imagine it's not, just to be clear, it's not just Richarlison that's a threat to his minutes.
Yeah.
They've got a very versatile front line of lots of different people who can play in different positions where Solanke might not. So yeah, all in all, I don't have a good read on it, but I'm not super positive about his minutes.
Yeah, I think that's fair. The only thing I'll say is Angie seems like he's now quite set on something like Son not really being a center forward anymore, but that can change. So I think someone was asking about...
the last one was a good question, right? The last question about Havertz, because I also wanted to ask Elevenify if if he has any thoughts on the data that we have for Havertz as a striker versus centre mid, because this seems to be contrasting data. And if he does get enough minutes as centre forward, then should we just flat out consider his output only as a centre forward?
Well, I think the thing with so firstly, obviously, it's a very good question, and it's a great modelling question. How do you deal with a case like Havertz, where he has played two very different roles and can at any point in any game both start in the game and then at some point during the game play those different roles? It's impossible. It is genuinely impossible. You can just make your best approximation of it. The only thing I would say is that it depends what kind of thing you value, but even his centre forward numbers are fine. You know, they're good. His centre numbers are good numbers by virtue of him being up front for Arsenal. Not so much, not so much him. I think, he's still a centre forward that doesn't shoot much. Perhaps doesn't need to make production because he's got good movement and stuff. But I'm relatively low on him. I think I've got like sort of roughly 13 goals for the season, something like that.
And also, does some uncertainty in his minutes also play a part, because he could easily be given a rest? They have more than enough players in those positions, right?
Yeah, and also, you're at the risk of touching another one of my trigger points, and that is Gabriel Jesus slander and disrespect. He's good. He's great. He's really important to that team. He adds a lot of value, and I think Arsenal are a lot more likely to win. They've got a lot more X points when Jesus is on the pitch. So yes, he's going to get minutes. And the issue with Jesus is always whether or not he's fit. Yeah. And from what I've seen, he looks very fit now. He hasn't been for a while, but he looks like he's getting back there. So you're totally right with that.
Yeah, I think Arteta would agree as well. So
absolutely. Just to quote Elevenify, maybe his numbers are great because he's played centre forward for Man City and Arsenal.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
But to be fair, obviously, I know it's like a bit of a joke, but I remember tweeting about that at the time when he left Man City. Also, remember when he left Man City, Arsenal weren't what they are now. Okay, that happened a while ago. And the big question was, I remember tweeting about it with one of his radar, the age-old question of, is his production and his stats like that because he plays at Man City, or is it because of him? And to be fair to him, he maintained them very well. And, from a team strength perspective, there was a big jump there, a much, much bigger jump than we see between Arsenal and Man City now. It's only really last season that Arsenal actually closed the gap.
Fair enough. And also, I would say, and maybe you think differently, but that was more because of their defense, right? I still think there's some gulf when it comes to attacking rates for the centre forward for the respective teams.
Yes, yeah, that's right.
Yeah, fair enough.
Yeah, I mean, trying to go through some questions.
Sartab has a question. So, Hi, Sartab. Sartab says, sorry if discussed, but is Elevenify planning to make decisions based on review or his own model, or a mix?
Has no one told Sartab I'm not playing FPL this season?
I think he might have.
So it is, but so I'm probably not actually playing official fantasy this season on my own. In terms of last season was a mix, but more my own numbers, like especially leaning on this kind of fantasy important stuff. But I used both heavily, but I was just very time poor last season. If I do play this season, it will be purely as sort of a bit of content for the fast fantasy model thing, because I put a poll up about if people would be interested in that, and it's currently 50 plus responses and it's 100% yes. So people do want to see that, but I just need to think about whether or not I have the energy or the time to do that.
Yeah, and I guess you can always just make an account that's dedicated to that and sort of separate that from your own more rigorous approach, I suppose, back in the day. Okay. I'm trying to generalize some of the other questions, but maybe just a quick one on Spurs. Right, so do you have them in the top 4 now? Is that correct?
Super close.
Okay,
It's
between them, Chelsea, Newcastle.
Yeah. It's very, very, very close. There's a simulated table on the website.
Yeah, and I think
That's
Chai, if you have a look at Elevenify's website, you'll find that. I don't think there's anything too much more to discuss because a lot of it's just on men's.
I'm not going to ask him about United anyway.
Actually, can I ask a question on? Sorry, there was a question on KDB, which Tiggy asked, and I think the question I suppose would be, maybe around how, because I think we discussed sort of modeling players who are on the back half of their careers, right? So, I mean, let's say we assume KDB's mins to somehow be quite good to start. I mean, how are you projecting someone like KDB this season?
So for KDB, I think my view on him is a little bit maybe different from other people's in that I don't think physically he's sort of, you know, everyone sort of says like he's just sort of cooked and crocked now, but I think actually from an in-game perspective, when he's actually playing, it doesn't look like he is, to me at least. Like, he looks fine and he produces the kind of things you would expect. The issue is when he has a big issue. It's not sort of minor issues where, you know, a really good example might be recently, if you watch the Euros, I think we were discussing Szoboszlai, and he just looked so, from game one, he just looked like he was carrying an injury, carrying too many minutes, you know, in a really obviously negative way. You know, you could actually look at him playing and say, I should adjust my priors on this because my prediction of him is not based on him playing like this. This is essentially a different player. I don't think that applies to KDB yet at all. So it's really just a case of his actual availability. And again, it kind of, you know, from a minutes perspective, it's sort of, it's a good exercise from, you know, again, like a fast fantasy zoomed out kind of perspective. It gets you thinking again about, the question is not, is he going to play 72 minutes or is he going to play 66 minutes? It's more a question of like decision hygiene of like, is he actually going to play? Is he going to be available? Is he going to flat out miss games because there's something else going on? You know, like more just high level important stuff rather than the granular stuff. That's what I think matters about KDB. I don't see any actual underlying drop off when he's on the pitch.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think that's about all the questions we had in the chat. So thank you everyone for joining the stream today. We will be back next week for the pre-Game Week 1 stream, which will kick off season 2024-25. So thank you again, Elevenify, for joining us today. For anyone who still hasn't checked out the site, please check out elevenify.com, his Substack site, where he posts all sorts of team strength ratings, his fast fantasy model, even player radars, where he talks in depth about certain players and how he thinks their careers will pan out, or how he thinks their play styles will pan out. So do check that out. And yeah, if you have any final words, Elevenify.
No, that's it from me. Thank you. Thank you everyone for listening. And yeah, check out the site. I hope you find it useful. If there's anything you want to see, reach out to me. And apart from that, thank you guys for having me.